The carriage wheels sank into the muddy ruts of the long, winding drive, each rotation splashing coarse droplets against the polished leather of the Duke's boots. Above, the sky was a churn of iron clouds, the sort that pressed upon the world with the weight of some unspoken accusation. It had been years since he had traversed this road, years since the ancestral house had lain in silence under the indifferent gaze of the countryside. Yet now, as the storm's first fat drops began to drum upon the carriage roof, a strange unease gripped him, not at the thought of returning, but at the anticipation of what awaited. The estate should have been empty. He had left it so. He had commanded it so. Silence, obedience, and the ghosts of memory were all he expected to encounter. And yet, even before the carriage came to a halt, a flicker of light shone from one of the lower windows. Small, steady, and utterly defiant against the gathering gloom, it was the first sign that his carefully constructed absence had been breached. The Duke, tall and unyielding even in his traveling cloak, leaned forward in the carriage, squinting. Candlelight danced upon the panes, throwing elongated shadows across the hall within, shadows that seemed almost alive. He felt a cold stir of irritation, swiftly tempered by a pang of curiosity. It was one thing for a servant to occupy his home in his absence. It was quite another to find a stranger therein, daring to kindle light where none should burn. He dismounted with deliberate care, boots crunching upon the wet gravel, and approached the door. The key turned with an unfamiliar weight in his hand, almost as though it resented the intrusion. Inside, the scent of beeswax and fresh-cut flowers mingled oddly with the faint tang of soot and damp, a discordant harmony of life that made him pause. The hall, once desolate and echoing with only the memory of his own footsteps, now hummed with an unanticipated vitality. And then he saw her. She stood near the hearth, a figure both slight and composed, her gown of muted blue pressed carefully against her form, as if she had expected him yet did not fully welcome the confrontation. Her hair, the color of polished chestnut, fell loosely over her shoulders, catching the firelight in a subtle sheen. She was arranging a vase of daisies, hands trembling only slightly, and as she turned, her gaze met his. In that instant, the room seemed to contract, the shadows drawing closer, suffocating in their intensity. She was a widow, he quickly surmised, not merely in circumstance, but in the fragile dignity that clung to her like a second skin. And with her a child, perhaps 6, perhaps 7, watched from behind a chair, eyes wide and curious, yet cautious. The boy's hair was a tousled crown of gold, and he clutched a wooden toy sword as if it might defend the honor of the house itself. The Duke's entrance, abrupt yet controlled, drew the woman to her full height. She curtsied, though it was a hesitant, almost fearful gesture, the sort that acknowledged authority while secretly challenging it. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful inflection of one raised in proper society, yet tempered by necessity. "I did not expect—" Her words faltered, and she gestured vaguely toward the hearth. "You did not expect me," he finished for her, his tone measured calm, and yet edged with steel. "Nor should you. This house has been mine in absence as in presence. I find it occupied." He allowed a pause, letting the weight of his observation hang in the smoky air. "Pray tell, madam, by whose authority have you made residence here?" Her eyes fell, a shadow crossing her delicate features. "By none, sir," she admitted, though the composure never fully broke. "Only circumstance, and the kindness of your steward. I had nowhere else to go." He considered her, the child, the small bouquet of daisies trembling between her fingers. The wind rattled the tall windows, as though echoing his unspoken impatience. A part of him, the part long hardened by society's cold judgment and personal betrayals, demanded immediate expulsion. Yet another, more reluctant and insistent, observed the lines of her jaw, the faint, determined set of her shoulders, and found himself curious. "What is your name?" he asked. The simplicity of the question belied the careful calculation behind it. "Miss Eleanor Whitcomb," she replied, the syllables like a delicate chime in a cavernous hall. "And this is my son, Henry." The boy stepped forward, timidly, holding the toy sword aloft in silent introduction. The Duke's eyes, gray and assessing, swept over the child. The boy's resemblance to no one he recognized only heightened his suspicion and, paradoxically, his concern. He was reminded, against his will, of a life he had never allowed himself to imagine, a domestic scene, a household alive with the quiet rhythms of care, laughter, and small rebellions against solitude. Yet there was shame here, too. The very fact that a stranger made hearth fire in his house, that a widow had dared occupy the halls he had deemed inviolate, felt like a personal affront, a fracture in the order he had worked decades to maintain. "I see," he said finally, voice neutral but edged with authority. "And yet, you presume that mere circumstance grants you residence?" "Your Grace," she said, holding his gaze now with steadier courage, "I presume nothing. I seek only refuge. When I learned you had been away, I hoped your absence would not be disturbed by my presence." He studied her, noting the faint tremor in her fingers as they lingered upon the vase, the quiet dignity with which she bore the implied accusation of impropriety, and felt an unexpected twist of admiration. He did not know whether it was pride or irritation that caused his chest to tighten, nor did he immediately care to separate the two. "You understand," he said slowly, deliberately, "that the village already whispers, that your presence here, though temporary, I trust, has not gone unnoticed." Her gaze faltered. She had anticipated this confrontation, yet the sting of public speculation still wounded. "I am aware," she admitted, voice low, almost reverent, "and I would leave, were it possible, to avoid any impropriety." The Duke stepped closer, boots clicking on the polished stone floor. "Impropriety," he murmured, almost to himself, "is often a matter of perception rather than fact." His eyes lingered on hers, cold steel tempered by an unspoken curiosity. And yet one cannot simply remove perception. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and the candlelight flickered, casting them both in momentary half-shadow. Henry shifted behind his mother, clutching the toy sword as though it could ward off not only strangers, but the very storms of destiny. In that silence, heavy and charged, the house itself seemed to breathe around them, alive with unanticipated life and the quiet promise of upheaval. The Duke finally spoke, his voice a whisper now, yet carrying an unyielding gravity. "Then we ought to begin, Miss Wickham, with an understanding that what transpires beneath this roof will follow neither rumor nor ease. You are here, temporarily, perhaps, but temporarily is a notion easily abused, is it not?" Eleanor inclined her head, the ghost of a defiant smile brushing her lips. "I shall endeavor to respect your household, your Grace." He allowed himself a single measured step back, giving the impression of withdrawal, though inwardly the gears of scrutiny, fascination, and reluctant admiration turned in relentless motion. Outside, the storm's voice rose, battering the roof and shaking the leaded panes, and within, the air thickened with unspoken questions, tentative judgments, and the quiet tension of lives newly entangled. As the Duke moved toward the staircase, candlelight playing over the walls, he caught sight of the boy again, eyes luminous with innocent courage. And for a moment, the weight of the house's history, his authority, and the consequences of this intrusion pressed upon him with undeniable force. He understood, in the sharp clarity of that instant, that nothing within these walls would ever again be as he had left it. Henry stepped forward, voice small yet pointed. "Are you the master of this house, or merely its ghost?" The question lingered, tremulous, daring, and entirely unanswerable, and the Duke paused at the top of the stairs, shadows stretching before him. The storm outside mirrored in the storm within. Morning arrived not with serenity, but with a pale and watchful light that crept through the tall windows as though the house itself were reluctant to reveal what the night had permitted. The storm had passed, yet its memory lingered in the damp scent of earth and the faint tremor in the air, as though something within the walls had shifted irrevocably. The Duke rose early, as was his habit, though sleep had scarcely touched him. The echo of the child's question still lingered, unwelcome and persistent, unsettling a composure long practiced into permanence. He descended to the breakfast room, expecting distance, perhaps avoidance, but instead found the table laid with quiet precision. Silver gleamed. Porcelain rested in perfect symmetry. And there, already seated, was Miss Wickham, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, as though she had spent the early hours constructing a barrier no less formidable than the stone walls surrounding them. The child sat beside her, legs swinging faintly beneath the table, his curiosity undimmed by the tension that hung, delicate and invisible, between the adults. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head with measured grace. "I trust the night did not inconvenience you unduly." "Inconvenience," he replied, taking a seat opposite her, "is a matter of expectation. I find mine altered." His gaze flickered briefly toward the boy. "You rise early." Henry nodded, unashamed. "Mama says mornings belong to those who have something worth doing." A faint shadow of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps discomfort, crossed the Duke's features. "A commendable philosophy," he said, though his tone suggested he was unaccustomed to such simple declarations of purpose. Silence followed, not awkward, but weighted. The clink of cutlery, the faint rustle of fabric, the distant call of a bird beyond the window. Each sound seemed amplified, as though the house listened. Eleanor maintained her composure. Yet every movement spoke of awareness, of a consciousness that she was observed, assessed, and perhaps judged. By midday, the house had begun to stir with a different energy. Servants moved with renewed purpose, as though the Duke's presence had awakened dormant loyalties. Yet their glances toward Eleanor carried something else. Uncertainty, speculation, a fragile allegiance not yet broken but undeniably strained. Word, it seemed, had already begun its quiet journey beyond the estate walls. It was not until the following afternoon that the first token appeared. A parcel, modestly wrapped, was delivered to the small sitting room Eleanor had come to occupy. No note accompanied it, no mark of origin. Only the understated refinement of its contents betrayed intention. Within lay a shawl of fine wool, soft as whispered apology, its muted hue chosen with a care that could not be accidental. Eleanor held it for a long moment, her fingers tracing its edge, her expression unreadable. She did not ask its source. She did not need to. That evening, she wore it. The Duke noticed, though he gave no indication. Their paths crossed briefly in the corridor, candlelight casting long shadows between them. His eyes lingered a moment longer than propriety required, then shifted away, as though acknowledgment itself would grant the gesture a meaning he was not yet prepared to claim. The second token came less quietly. A tutor arrived at the estate, punctual and composed, bearing credentials that spoke of distinction. He requested audience not with the Duke, but with Miss Wickham, explaining that he had been engaged to oversee the education of Master Henry. Eleanor's surprise was genuine, her confusion evident, yet she accepted the arrangement with cautious gratitude. When she later encountered the Duke in the library, her voice carried a restrained edge. "You are most generous, Your Grace," she said, standing just within the threshold, as though unwilling to trespass further into his domain. "Though I fear I cannot repay such consideration." He did not look up immediately, allowing the silence to stretch before answering. "Consideration implies intent," he replied at last. "I'm merely ensure that what exists under my roof does not fall into neglect. And yet," she said softly, "it is not your responsibility." His gaze lifted then, steady and unyielding. "Responsibility is seldom assigned with fairness, Miss Wickham. It is simply born." The words lingered, heavier than their simplicity suggested. Beyond the estate, the whispers had begun to sharpen. In the village, glances lingered longer than courtesy allowed. Conversations paused when Eleanor passed, only to resume in hushed tones once she had gone. By the end of the week, the narrative had taken form. An absent Duke returned to find a widow and child installed within his house, and rather than expel them, he permitted their stay. Such details did not invite understanding. They invited invention. The scandal deepened with the arrival of a visitor. Mr. Pembroke, a gentleman of local standing and indiscreet curiosity, arrived unannounced, his manner polished yet probing. He was received in the drawing-room, where Eleanor, bound by circumstance, could not refuse his presence. The Duke entered shortly after, his expression one of controlled neutrality, though his eyes carried a sharper awareness. "I had not expected to find the house so lively," Pembroke remarked, his gaze drifting toward Eleanor with a thinly veiled interest. "Your Grace has been full of surprises of late." "I find," the Duke replied coolly, "that surprise is often the product of insufficient understanding." "Indeed," Pembroke said lightly, though his smile held an edge. "And yet, one cannot help but observe the arrangement. A lady, A child, no formal introduction, no explanation. Society is, after all, inclined toward curiosity. Eleanor's hands tightened slightly in her lap, though her expression remained composed. The air grew taut, the silence between each word stretching like a thread near breaking. "You mistake curiosity for entitlement, sir," the Duke said, his voice quiet, yet carrying unmistakable authority. "What occurs within this house is not subject to public speculation." Pembroke inclined his head, though the glint in his eyes did not fade. "Of course, though one hopes that such generosity does not invite misinterpretation." The Duke took a single step forward, the movement subtle yet commanding. "I assure you," he said, each word measured with deliberate precision, "that any interpretation formed without understanding will be corrected with equal clarity." The dismissal was unmistakable. Pembroke rose, offering a shallow bow, his curiosity unsatisfied but his caution newly awakened. When he departed, the room seemed to exhale, though the tension did not fully dissipate. Eleanor rose slowly, her composure intact, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, gratitude, perhaps, or the burden of a debt she had not sought. "You should not have intervened," she said quietly. "It will only encourage further speculation." "Speculation," the Duke replied, turning slightly toward a window, "requires only the absence of truth. I have merely ensured that falsehood does not go unchallenged." "And what of the truth?" she asked, her voice softer still. He paused, the question settling between them with unexpected weight. "The truth," he said at last, "is rarely of interest to those who prefer scandal." Her gaze lingered on him, searching, questioning, as though sensing the boundaries of something unspoken. Outside, the late afternoon light dimmed, shadows lengthening across the floor, blurring the distinction between what was seen and what was concealed. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to retire, she found another parcel waiting, this one less subtle, its seal unmistakably bearing the mark of a name she had hoped never to encounter again. Her breath caught as she broke it open, the contents within threatening not merely her place in the house, but the fragile dignity she had fought to preserve. And for the first time since her arrival, the refuge she had found began to feel perilously close to exposure. The storm returned that evening, though not with the reckless violence of the previous night. Instead, it arrived as a muted symphony of rain and wind, tapping against the tall windows like a hesitant visitor seeking permission to enter. The hallways of the estate were dimly lit, the flicker of candle flames casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. Eleanor moved quietly, the hem of her gown brushing the polished floor, carrying the faint scent of lavender and damp wool. She paused by the window, peering through the misted glass, noting the darkened sky and the trees bent beneath the wind's persistent insistence. Henry slept fitfully in the next room, the faintest whimper escaping his lips as the storm deepened, and her heart constricted in a rhythm of quiet fear. The Duke entered without announcement, his presence felt before it was seen. His footsteps, measured and unhurried, carried the weight of authority, yet there was an unfamiliar hesitance in his bearing. Eleanor turned, sensing rather than seeing him, and for a moment the air between them thickened with unspoken expectation. "You awake late," he said, voice low, the words almost lost beneath the patter of rain. "I could say the same," she replied, forcing a calm she did not feel. "It seems we are both prisoners of the weather." "A prisoner," he mused, stepping closer. Candlelight caught the angles of his face, revealing shadows that were not entirely his own. "And yet prisoners of our own making often endure best when the company is tolerable." Her lips parted, a flicker of surprise passing through her expression, though she recovered immediately. "Company can be tolerable," she said carefully, "but trust is earned, your grace, and one does not hand it freely to shadows." He inclined his head, the barest acknowledgment of her caution. "Indeed," he said, "shadows conceal many truths, some of which it is safer not to reveal." He paused, allowing the silence to settle between them, and for the first time, Eleanor noted the weight in his gaze, a gravity that was at once commanding and weary. "You are too generous with your presence," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It is unnerving." "Generosity," he replied softly, "is often mistaken for intent, and yet I find myself compelled to offer it, whether it is desired or not." The rain intensified, drumming upon the roof in a relentless cadence. Eleanor felt the room shrink around them, the shadows curling closer as though eager to overhear confessions meant only for each other. She clenched her hands briefly, smoothing them over the folds of her gown, tried to anchor herself against the rising tide of emotion she had carefully contained for weeks. "You are patient beyond measure," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "And yet I cannot escape the thought that you are observing me, judging me." His eyes softened, a flicker of something she could not yet name passing through their depths. "I am neither merciful nor cruel without cause," he said quietly. "But I do not hide my attention from those who dwell under my roof. You should know that nothing escapes it. And yet," his voice faltered, a rare hesitation that revealed the human beneath the Duke. "And yet, I find that I observe with curiosity I do not fully understand." She inhaled sharply, the words striking deeper than any declaration of intent could. Curiosity, he had said. Not command, not interference, but curiosity, a subtle admission that he saw her, fully and deliberately, in all her dignity and vulnerability. Eleanor's chest tightened. She had prepared herself for scrutiny, for condemnation, perhaps even dismissal, but never for the weight of interest tempered by restraint. "I have feared," she began, her voice barely above the whisper of the rain, "that this arrangement is unsustainable, that one day I shall be cast aside and the protection I have found here will vanish like smoke." He stepped closer, the heat from his presence mingling with the candle-warmed air, creating a tension neither could ignore. "Protection," he said slowly, "is not always a burden borne willingly. Sometimes it is claimed, sometimes granted, but it is rarely given without risk to both the protector and protected." Her eyes met his, wide and searching. "And if the risk proves too great?" she asked, a tremor threading her words. "What then? What becomes of those left behind?" He looked away briefly, the flame light casting half his face into shadow, revealing a hardness tempered by something quieter, something more tender than she had ever glimpsed. "Then," he said at last, voice low and deliberate, "one must confront it. There is no honor in evasion, nor dignity in silence." The words hung between them, weighty and unyielding. Eleanor swallowed, the breath catching in her throat, for she knew that the Duke spoke not only of circumstance but of feeling, of truths rarely permitted to surface. She had been a widow long enough to know the dangers of confession, the peril in acknowledging desires that could never be safely admitted. And yet, the isolation of the storm, the quiet intensity of his presence, made concealment impossible. She began, then paused, collecting herself. "I have not only feared the loss of safety, but the loss of dignity. To be whispered about, to be subject to the village's speculation, to live as an intruder in your house. It has been a constant ache." He did not interrupt. He only listened, the storm outside mirroring the quiet storm of emotion within the room. "I did not come here seeking favor," she continued, the words falling with fragile honesty. "But neither could I remain elsewhere. And now that I am here, I cannot escape the feeling that I am neither truly welcome nor fully condemned, that I exist in some impossible middle." A long silence followed, the kind that carries more weight than speech. Finally he spoke, the sound low, measured and intimate. "You exist," he said, "in a way that few are permitted to, not as subject, not as object, but as witness to the truths I have long hidden, and to the life I have neglected to allow myself." Her breath caught. "Witness," she repeated softly, "to truths you have hidden?" He stepped even closer, the distance between them charged with anticipation and restraint. "I have abandoned many things," he said quietly. "A home left unattended, friendships left to decay, opportunities left unclaimed. And yet, your presence has made me aware that absence is not always empty and observation is not always sufficient." Eleanor's hands fell to her lap, her fingers intertwined as though to steady herself against the rising tide of emotion. "And what am I to do with this awareness?" she asked. "How can I navigate without destruction?" He exhaled slowly, the sound mingled with the rain outside. "One cannot navigate alone," he said, voice steady but soft. "One must speak, and one must listen. There are truths, Miss Wickham, that were never meant to be spoken, yet they demand utterance. For a long moment, the room held its breath with them. Shadows clung to the corners. The storm's rhythm softened to a murmur, and for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to meet the Duke's gaze fully, unshielded and unguarded. In that silent communion, a fragile bridge formed, built of unspoken admission, tentative trust, and the first trembling acknowledgement of desire restrained by circumstance. And then, as though summoned by some unbidden instinct, the door to the nursery creaked open, and a small voice, hesitant yet insistent, called from the threshold. "Mama, is it going to stay forever?" The Duke's eyes met Eleanor's, and in that shared glance, they understood that the truth they had begun to voice would not remain hidden much longer, and that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest rising within the walls of the house itself. The invitation arrived by hand the morning after the storm, a seal of wax pressed firmly into the crest of the Duke's house, a summons to the city's grand assembly, a ball that promised the scrutiny of every curious eye and the judgment of every society matron. Eleanor held the letter with a trembling hand, the paper warm against her palm, and Henry tugged lightly at her gown, his eyes bright with naive excitement. "Mama, will there be music?" he asked. She smiled faintly, concealing a tension that tightened her chest like a vice. Music, yes. But under its beauty lurked whispers, glances, and speculation that could wound far deeper than a careless word. The Duke observed her quietly, his expression inscrutable, as though weighing her composure against the invisible tide of society's gaze. "You will attend," he said simply, the authority in his tone, leaving no space for polite refusal. Eleanor inclined her head, though inwardly she bristled at the notion. "I do not wish to draw attention, Your Grace. I am but a guest in this house, a shadow unworthy of notice." "Attention is inevitable," he replied, "but one may control how it is received. Courage is measured not by concealment, but by the manner in which one faces the inevitable." Her fingers lingered over the letter, tracing the elegant script as though seeking courage from its ink. She wished she could refuse, but she also understood the unspoken weight of the Duke's decision. If she absented herself, society would interpret her flight as weakness, scandal, or worse. Her choice, though constrained, was hers to wield with careful grace. Evening arrived in a wash of gold and crimson, sunlight retreating behind clouds streaked with violet, as the carriage carried them toward the city. Eleanor clutched the shawl he had sent, the fabric of quiet reassurance against the storm of expectation. Henry sat between them, a small figure swaddled in warmth, his innocence an unspoken defiance against the world's scrutiny. The Duke's hand brushed hers briefly as he steadied the boy. It was the merest contact, yet it conveyed both possession and protection, a claim made without ceremony yet impossible to ignore. The ballroom rose before them, a glittering expanse of polished floors and crystal chandeliers, the scent of roses mingling with perfume and candle wax. Every eye turned toward the arriving Duke and his companion, a subtle hush falling over the assembly. Eleanor felt the weight of scrutiny descend upon her like a tangible fog, each glance an accusation, each whispered syllable a blade. Yet she met it with a composure that belied the racing of her pulse, guided by the silent counsel of the Duke's unwavering presence. A gentleman of considerable age and indiscretion approached, bowing with practiced civility, though his eyes betrayed curiosity sharpened to subtle malice. "Your Grace, how fortunate to find the house so enlivened," he said, glancing toward Eleanor. "I had feared the rumors were exaggerated." The Duke's eyes, gray and piercing, fixed upon him with quiet precision that silenced the man's next words before they could take shape. "Rumor," he said, voice measured, carrying across the space between them, "is a dangerous creature. One must either master it or be undone by it." Eleanor's breath caught. The words were not merely a rebuke. They were a shield, an assertion that whatever society whispered, she would not be abandoned. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging protection without need for further ceremony, the faintest flicker of relief softening her otherwise steady composure. The evening unfolded with measured grace. Music played, and couples swept across the polished floor, a blur of silk and taffeta. Eleanor remained near the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped lightly before her, eyes tracing the ornate details of the room to avoid the pointed glances of curious spectators. Yet the Duke remained near, subtly orchestrating proximity, guiding her away from conversation that might compromise dignity, intervening with quiet authority, whenever a remark threatened to pierce her composure. A whisper rose behind them, faint but deliberate. Eleanor felt its sting, the weight of judgment pressing against her shoulders. A widow and child, the voice said, living under the Duke's roof. One wonders at propriety. The Duke's hand brushed hers, a gentle but unmistakable assertion. One wonders often at what cannot be seen, he murmured, so softly that only she could hear. His presence alone transformed the whisper from accusation to irrelevance. His authority a protective barrier against the sting of scandal. Despite his careful orchestration, Eleanor sensed a fragile equilibrium of the evening teetering. Another gentleman approached, polite in tone but pointed in curiosity. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "it is unusual to see you in the Duke's company. Pray, how long have you been under his protection?" Her fingers clenched slightly at her sides. The Duke turned, his gaze sweeping the man with quiet precision, and spoke with deliberate clarity. "Any insult directed toward this lady shall be understood as an insult to my name, and I assure you, I do not forgive easily." The declaration drew a startled silence, the room pausing to absorb the authority behind the words. Eleanor's heart thudded violently, a mixture of relief, fear, and something she could not yet name. The intervention had preserved her dignity, yet also confirmed the scrutiny she could not escape. She glanced at the Duke, noting the faint tightening of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. The storm of judgment outside their protective orbit had been stilled, but the cost of visibility was now laid bare. In a quiet corner, Eleanor found herself alone for a fleeting moment. She touched the shawl once more, the soft wool grounding her in the fragility and constancy of her new reality. The whispers, the judgment, the quiet malice of those who misunderstood her. None could diminish the assertion made on her behalf. Yet she felt the weight of what it meant. To be seen, to be defended, to be chosen in a society that prized reputation above all. The Duke approached, steps deliberate and measured, closing the space between them with careful intent. "You have done well," he said softly, voice carrying both approval and acknowledgement. Courage, in its quiet form, often achieves what boldness alone cannot. "And yet," Eleanor said, voice trembling slightly with the intensity of relief and lingering fear, "the cost is never mine alone to bear. You stake your name, your grace for my presence." He looked down at her, eyes darkened with quiet intensity. "Some risks," he said, "are worth taking, though the consequences may stretch beyond our control. One cannot remain hidden forever, not from truth, not from desire, and certainly not from judgment." The orchestra swelled, and the dancers spun past them in a glittering blur, oblivious to the tension that clung between two souls now irrevocably intertwined. Eleanor understood in that moment that the cost of being seen had been exacted, yet also that the declaration of intent, his defense of her dignity, had shifted the balance. She was no longer merely a shadow within the Duke's house. She was a presence acknowledged, protected, and impossible to ignore. Yet the uncertainty remained delicate and unyielding. The whispers would continue. The speculation would endure, and the house beyond the city would still contain its own storms of judgment and consequence. Eleanor's pulse quickened, not with fear alone, but with a quiet, growing awareness that the journey they had begun together was far from its conclusion. Outside, the city streets gleamed under gaslight, rain-slicked and shimmering, reflecting a world in which perception often outweighed reality. Inside, the Duke and Eleanor shared a glance that spoke volumes, neither needing words to confirm the fragile alliance forged that night, the delicate assertion of courage, and the unspoken acknowledgement of desire restrained by circumstance. And then, as if the night itself conspired to remind them of the precariousness of their position, a letter arrived, delivered with a hush of urgency, bearing a seal that Eleanor recognized immediately, a name that threatened not merely to expose her past, but unravel the careful equilibrium they had so recently achieved. The letter did not tremble in Eleanor's hand when she broke its seal, though something within her did. The wax yielded with a quiet fracture, and the name within, etched in a precise, merciless script, rose before her like a specter she had long believed buried. It was her late husband's brother, a man whose regard for propriety had always been secondary to his appetite for control, now invoking his right to claim both her and the child under pretense of guardianship. The words were courteous, even polished, yet beneath them lay a threat sharpened by law and emboldened by scandal. He would arrive within days. He would restore what he called order. He would not be denied. Eleanor folded the letter slowly, each crease deliberate, as though she might contain its consequences within the paper itself. The ballroom still shimmered with music and laughter beyond the corridor, yet its brightness had become unbearable, a cruel contrast to the quiet unraveling within her chest. She knew what must be done before doubt could weaken her resolve. She returned to the Duke without delay. Her steps measured, her composure absolute. He saw it at once, the change, the distance carefully constructed behind her eyes. "You have received something of consequence," he said, voice low, already edged with concern. "Yes," she replied, offering the letter without embellishment, "and it requires my departure." He read it once, then again, the silence stretching until it became its own form of protest. "This man presumes much," he said finally, the calmness of his tone belying the force beneath it. "He presumes law," she answered, "and society will favor his claim, given circumstances." Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady but resolute. "I will not allow your name to be further entangled in my affairs." "My name," he said, stepping closer, "is mine to risk, and my dignity is mine preserve," she returned softly. "You have given me more than I had any right to expect: shelter, respect, a measure of peace. I will not repay that generosity with your ruin." His jaw tightened. "You speak as though the matter is settled." "It must be," she said. "I will leave tonight." The words fell between them with finality, yet something in his expression resisted their conclusion. "You would depart without allowing me to answer this challenge?" he asked. "I would depart because I understand it," she replied. "If I remain, he will come here. He will accuse. He will provoke. And whatever defense you offer will bind you to me in a way that cannot be undone." "Perhaps I do not wish it undone," he said, the restraint in his voice fracturing at last. Eleanor's breath faltered, but she did not yield. "Wishes do not alter consequence," she said, "and I have lived too long at the mercy of others' desires to mistake them for protection." Henry, who had lingered near the doorway, watching with solemn, uncomprehending eyes, stepped forward then, his small hand finding hers. "Mama, are we going away?" he asked. She knelt, gathering him close, pressing her lips to his hair as though to anchor herself. "Only for a little while," she murmured. "We must be very brave." The Duke turned away, crossing the window as though the night beyond might offer some counsel. The city lay hushed beneath gaslight, its streets glistening, its secrets innumerable. When he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness born not of calm, but decision. "If you go," he said, "you will not go unprotected." "I have managed thus far," she replied gently. "Not without cost," he returned, "and I will not permit further injury where I might prevent it." She rose, meeting him once more with quiet resolve. "You have already prevented more than you know, but this is mine to bear." He faced her fully then, the distance between them charged with everything unsaid. "You mistake me, Miss Wickham," he said. "I do not act from obligation. I act because I choose to." "And I choose to leave," she answered, the words soft but unyielding. There was no further argument that could be made without betraying more than either had yet dared to confess. The carriage was arranged with efficiency that bordered on severity, the servants moving with subdued urgency, aware that something momentous, though unspoken, was unfolding. Eleanor gathered only what was necessary, refusing indulgence, refusing delay. Each object left behind felt like a quiet severance. When she descended the entrance hall, Henry bundled close at her side. She found the Duke waiting. He did not offer farewell, nor did he attempt to dissuade her again. Instead, he extended his hand, and within it lay a small, familiar object, the key to the house. "You may find need of it again," he said. She hesitated, then accepted it, her fingers brushing his in a contact that carried more weight than any declaration. "I hope," she said, "that I shall not." "Hope," he replied, "is a fragile companion. I prefer certainty." Their gazes held, the moment stretching until it threatened to break beneath its own intensity. Then she turned, stepping into the carriage, the door closing with soft finality that echoed through the hall. The journey was quiet, the rhythm of wheels against the road a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. Henry slept against her shoulder, his trust unshaken, his world still intact. She envied him that simplicity, even as she resolved to preserve it at any cost. They had not gone far when the carriage slowed, then halted. A second set of wheels approached, the sound unmistakable even before the door was opened from without. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a sudden, inexplicable certainty rising within her. The Duke stood there unaccompanied, the night wind tugging at his coat, his expression stripped of all pretense. "You would leave without hearing me fully," he said. "I heard you," she replied, though her voice lacked its former steadiness. "No," he said, stepping closer. "You heard what I allowed. You did not hear what I withheld." The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The road, the carriage, the distant city, all fading into irrelevance. "And what did you withhold?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, unflinching. "That I would rather be undone by truth than preserved by silence. That your presence has altered more than the state of my house. And that if you depart, you take with you whatever remains of the life I have only just begun to acknowledge." Eleanor's breath caught, the careful defenses she constructed trembling beneath the force of his words. "You risk everything," she said. "Your name, your standing." "My name has endured worse than honesty," he interrupted. "My standing has been emptier than solitude. What I risk now, I risk willingly." Henry stirred then, his small voice breaking through the charged silence. "Mama, are we staying?" Eleanor looked at the child, then back at the man before her, and something within her, pride, fear, the long habit of retreat, began to yield. She saw not the Duke, not the weight of his title, but the man who had chosen, again and again, to see her not as burden or scandal, but as equal, as companion, as possibility. She stepped down from the carriage. "I cannot promise ease," she said, her voice steadier now, though still touched by vulnerability. "Nor can I promise that the world will be kind." "I require neither," he replied, "only that you remain." The night seemed to hold its breath as she placed her hand in his, the gesture simple, irrevocable. Behind them, the carriage waited, a path not taken. Before them, uncertainty stretched vast and uncharted. Yet within that uncertainty lay something stronger than fear, a quiet, unyielding certainty that what they chose now would define not only their reputations, but their lives. And as the first light of dawn began to edge the horizon, soft and resolute, it became clear that what remained, when pride at last fell silent, was not ruin, but the fragile, enduring promise of a future neither had ever dared to claim.